Leningrad, Peter the Great's beautiful window on the west, built on land he took from the Swedes during the Great Northern War. Originally named St. Petersburg after its founder, Leningrad had always been a center of Western culture in Russia. Placed strategically on the Gulf of Finland, it was easily defendable against sea attack. The great Enlightenment philosopher Voltaire once said that the united magnificence of all the cities in Europe could but equal St. Petersburg. He later added, though the place where it is built was meant rather as a lair for wolves and bears than for the dwelling of men. In 1917, the Russian Revolution overthrew the Tsar and eventually saw in a communist government led by Vladimir Lenin. The soldiers and workers of the Petrograd St. Petersburg Soviet were the ones who led to the success of the revolution. Upon the death of the great Bolshevik leader in 1924, St. Petersburg was renamed in his honor. Because of this, Leningrad was one of the primary cultural centers of Bolshevism. In 1939, a non-aggression pact was signed between Stalin, successor to Lenin and Adolf Hitler. The pact ensured neutrality between the two nations, but it was a promise Hitler was to break, due to his view of Russians as Untermenschen, or beasts. In 1941, Hitler was confident of his dominance over the West, and quickly turned his attention to the Bolshevik plague of the East. Operation Barbarossa was initiated, and the German army quickly routed the Reds for the first couple of months. Hitler's primary targets were Leningrad, Stalingrad, and Moscow, the industrial and cultural centers of Bolshevism. Although the Red Army was extremely large, numbering about 1.7 million men, they were poorly equipped, some not even owning guns, and many without uniforms. On the other hand, the powerful German military machine was quick, ruthless, and efficient. Stalin at the beginning was cynical, and ordered much of the army not to advance or go against much larger forces, causing up to 1 million casualties. The people of Leningrad were afraid that the Germans were coming to raze their city to the ground and organize defenses. Nearly 1 million civilians were organized into construction teams to build walls and defense lines. Often women and teenagers were working for 14 hours at a time, only to collapse from exhaustion. Over 200,000 civilians were given only hours of training and immediately transported to the front. Almost half of these became immediate casualties. On August 21, 1941, Lieutenant General Popov declared to the city,
"The enemy is at our gates. Let us rise like one man in defense of our city, our homes, our family, honor, and freedom."
Operation Barbarossa was Hitler's plan to annihilate Bolshevism as well as the Slavic states of Russia, which was a main point of his attacks. The reason for this was actually his ideals and Lebensraum, which is living space for his German Reich or Third Reich. He hated the Slavs because he thought they were inferior race and just wanted to annihilate them off the face of the earth. And so their invasion of Leningrad was actually showed his hatred of the Slavs, because this is not only a central aspect of Bolshevism, but it's also a huge center for many Slavic people as well as Slavic ideals.
Northwest Front under Kuznetsov. In theory, the Russian forces were larger and more generously supplied with tanks, guns, and aircraft. In practice, the Red Army as a whole proved to be so demoralized by internal disruptions that they were disastrously unprepared. In addition, much of the Russian equipment was obsolete or unserviceable, with the result that in the opening battles at least, there was to be no real contest.
With the hundreds of miles of walls, thousands of pillboxes, and the stubbornly resisting Red Army, the Wehrmacht knew that it had become a siege. As the city too realized this, they turned to their food supplies, and Dmitry Pavlov, an administrator, made the estimates of 35 days of flour and grain, meat for 33 days, fats for 45 to 60 days, and 60 days of sugar.
The German plan for the city of Leningrad was to seal off Leningrad hermetically and then weaken it by terror and growing starvation, as written by German Lieutenant General Walter. This idea would prove highly effective and brutal. On the 21st and 30th of August, the Germans succeeded in cutting off all railway links to the city, and from then on, the only way for supplies to get in would be through airlift, which proved expensive and highly ineffective due to the weather. Thus, during wintertime, the coldest and most necessary time for food, due to humans burning energy to keep them warm, almost no food could get in the city. To make matters worse, German artillery or aircraft bombing of the city or barges carrying food would cause fires that would burn warehouses of food and rations.
After a furious exchange of advances and retreats, by the end of the month, the defenders were hanging onto their city by their fingernails. It seemed inevitable that Leningrad would capitulate. But as Zhukov awaited a renewed assault, the 4th Panzer Group suddenly departed to join the battle for Moscow, and the remaining German forces began to build defences. Hitler had decreed that Leningrad would not be taken by force. It would instead be starved into submission.
During the first winter of the siege, the city was running low on food and running low on fuel. And obviously the winter in Russia is very cold, usually under 0 degrees. So the people were freezing and starving, and at the same time they were being bombed by Germans. The morale of the city was very low, and people often didn't even regard family or friends. They just tried to live their life, tried to get whatever food they could. People would often walk out into the street and simply die, and no one would care because soon afterwards the snow would cover them. By the end of the winter, when the snow melted, there were thousands, if not tens of thousands of corpses preserved by the snow. Morale was all the Russians would have during the siege, and anyone who committed the slightest offense, such as hide food or complain about the conditions, would simply be shot. By October, 1 month into the siege, people had begun to die. The weather had already gone below freezing, and all the fuel supplies had been exhausted. Therefore, a further cut in rationing was applied. More and more people started to die. Children and sedentary workers received the least food and were the first people to die. On top of all this, the Germans had a steady supply line and were keeping up their front, while the Russians were unable to initiate a breakthrough or a successful counterattack. Then, hope began to appear as the lake seemed to be frozen over and people crossed it and brought back 33 tons of food, a small amount compared to the 3,000 tons consumed by the city per day. Then, the citizens of Leningrad began to make a tram or railway across the lake so that food could arrive. However, the poor construction of the road led to many problems and the Germans were inching closer and closer to the city. In the darkest days of the siege, each citizen of Leningrad was only getting hardly enough food for any human being to survive. But by the time the complete supply line was cut off, they were only sending a couple tons of food across the lake per day, which was not enough for the city. So the citizens were forced to improvise. They were getting anything they could eat. They were killing rats, horses, and when they ran out of animals, they just started mixing sawdust and dirt into their bread. And by that time, almost 80% of their bread was made of sawdust and dirt.
Rations were cut multiple times in November, dropping to 250 grams for factory workers and only 125 grams for office workers and dependents. Death became a daily occurrence for Leningraders. By December, all power had gone. The water supply failed. Water had to be gathered from holes busted in the ice. The temperature had dropped to negative 32 degrees Celsius. Men and women would die where they fell, too weak from hunger to stand back up.
The people had begun to get desperate, but were not willing to give in to the Germans. They began to eat almost anything that moved. Someone once described it as a woman was looking for a cat, not to keep as a pet, but to eat. People would mix dust into their grain to add volume. People would eat tree bark and grass, and eventually they resorted to cannibalism where groups of hungry people would fall upon an individual. Eventually the Russians recaptured Tikhvin and were able to restore their normal supply line.
Over 1 million civilians in the city of Leningrad had died. This is a good example of how total war and as well as Russian morale to hold the city at all costs would contribute to the civilian deaths and to the overall destruction of the city. Invading Germany towards the end of the war, they also demonstrated total war tactics by committing heinous crimes against German civilians as well as razing German cities to the ground.
Russians were able to inflict more damage to Germany's vast army due to the cold Soviet winter which German soldiers had not adapted to. The German advance into the city and end to the almost 900-day siege finally came on January 27, 1944. The nearly 2.5-year siege caused much damage to the city and its people both physically and mentally. The combination of starvation and war caused up to 1.5 million soldiers and civilians dead, and many more, up to 1.4 million, Women and children were evacuated from the city. The city of Leningrad was turned into a wasteland by the constant warfare and bombardment of the German Air Force. Overall, the Siege of Leningrad turned out to be one of the most horrific attacks on any city in modern history.